This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today, we bring you part 2 of my conversation with University of Montana law professors Cowie and Constance. Our goal is to help you make sense of the early days of President Trump's second term. We'll pick it up with a conversation about what can happen when an entire agency like the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau is shut down. So, Craig, you're describing a scenario that, to my naive ear, sounds like just bad execution with unintended, messy consequences. But I didn't hear that anything happened in there was illegal.
No, that's not illegal. I think the illegal aspect is sort of the scope of shutting the agency down as a whole. That part, I think, is illegal.
Okay.
But that's more the implication. I mean, this is both the implications of what happens when you shut the agency down, but also why, if you're going to shut an agency down, you really want Congress to do it, because Congress will think about all of these things. They'll transfer all these powers. Just as another example, so the CFPB is the primary regulator for 19 separate consumer finance laws. Those laws all still exist. So the CFPB is not enforcing them because they're not doing anything.
Sure.
But attorneys general can enforce them. Consumers can sometimes enforce them. Other state banking regulators can enforce them. If you're a business, this is just a world of uncertainty as to, and those regulations can't be changed because no one can change them except for the CFPB. So like when COVID happened, the CFPB issued a bunch of changes to regulations to take into account the fact that we had both a huge amount of economic disruption, but also just people couldn't go to work for a while there. And so they extended deadlines, they did some other stuff. If there's no CFPB operating, there's no one to do that if that happens.
Yeah.
And that just, there's a laundry list of changes that industry would like to see in the regulations. I think last time I looked, they got something like 50 petitions for changes from various industry groups in recent past, and they can't make any of those. They can't decide what, and it doesn't mean they would necessarily, but they certainly would think about them. They would have to consider them and decide what to do. But if there's nobody there, that can't happen. And we're just sort of stuck with the rules as they were issued.
Yeah. Is there anything on the horizon that is a more explicit test case of the separation of powers? Constance, I'm thinking of something like, isn't there a funding deadline in March that we're going to hit? That Congress has to pass an appropriations bill or a funding bill to keep the government open from the proverbial shutdown?
Yeah, because we have 3 branches of government. When we're talking about the litigation, we are talking about conflicts that need to be resolved by the court. The government funding deadline, though, is an example of something that the court's not going to have anything to do with, right? That's really going to heighten the stakes of the executive versus legislative power battle. I can't predict what's going to happen, but what we have seen generally so far from Congress is sometimes more or less sort of vocal minority objecting. The overall posture of Congress has been compliance, even with legislators kind of endorsing the executive acting outside of constitutional bounds. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the funding deadline, however, this is an example of a place where Congress can't just say, okay, right? Congress has to legislate. Congress has to do something.
Yeah.
And so how it's going to play out, I don't know, but I do think it will tell us a lot about whether Congress is going to stand up for its own governmental power when it's forced to take affirmative action.
I think the funding debate is a little to the side of of your original question, but I'll just note that in the recent past, so the House and the Senate are both controlled by Republicans. The reconciliation bill is going to come out of the House, which will set that. The Senate Republicans have already said that they have a slightly different view of what that should look like.
That's the funding bill?
Yeah, that's the funding bill.
Okay.
But to date, I don't believe any of the recent bills have passed without Democratic support. Now, Speaker Johnson has said that he believes he can garner support and won't need Democratic support.
He's only got a 3-vote majority, right?
That's right. And he has said he can do that for the bill in March. If they don't, we'll have a government shutdown.
Yeah.
And so then just everything except for certain exempted services will come offline, which has happened in the past. And we'll see some Democratic House members have indicated that they won't go along with efforts now, given what's all the rest of the stuff going on, unless Congress does step up and take a position on what's happening. But we're not going to know until that happens. That's not going to generate a constitutional crisis. That's just going to generate a whole lot of misery and stress for people if the government shuts down and certain essential services stop happening. But I think either one of the firing cases, because there have been dozens of lawsuits since it started on a whole wide range of topics. At last count, there were 18 orders staying various attempts by President Trump to do things.
So staying just
means stopping.
Stop.
Yes, many states are involved in this litigation too, because they have resources and also they have working relationships where they need this information. Something like that, or something like the birthright citizenship fight will go up, which is something we haven't talked about, but is basically an executive attempt to amend the Constitution.
Right. Maybe
that's
own. Instructive to talk about that, right? Because that would be the president trying to explicitly change the Constitution.
So the 14th Amendment provides that if you are born in the United States to parents who are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, that you are conferred citizenship upon birth. The executive order that President Trump has issued it's described as an attempt to undo birthright citizenship, and that's certainly true if you define birthright citizenship as we have understood it to exist since the 14th Amendment was ratified shortly after the Civil War. His argument on birthright citizenship is that there's been a misunderstanding of what subject to the jurisdiction of the United States means.
So he's arguing some degree of ambiguity in the amendment?
Yeah, he's arguing either that the amendment is somewhat ambiguous, giving him the ability to define it as the executive, as the president who has plenary power over foreign affairs, or that, in fact, our sort of understanding of what this means is just wrong, that it's wrong as a matter of constitutional interpretation, and, in fact, subject to the jurisdiction includes a much narrower category of people than we have understood it to mean.
Ultimately, that seems like one that'll go to the Supreme Court, I would think.
I think it's safe to say that all of these are going
eventually
to the Supreme Court.
I mean, which one is going to get there fastest, do we think?
That's impossible to know, but I will say that any time a federal court takes what we call injunctive action, so that means ordering a party to do something or not to do something, so all of these stays qualify, you can appeal that immediately. You can appeal it if you ask for that relief and you're denied it. There are several of these cases are already on appeal in the circuits. The circuits tend to take much longer. It tends to be somewhere on the order of a year or more for them to decide something. They can move faster in some circumstances, certainly in certain kinds of cases like election cases. They will often move quite quickly to try and keep things on track for an upcoming election. And so I don't think there's any way to legitimately predict which one will get there first or exactly when it will get there. And I think the real question is, along the way, do we start to see the willful disobedience, right? So if orders are in place and they're upheld as they have been to date, then at some point, will the executives just say, we're not going to cooperate? So we are going to fire those people, and they can then sue us or whatever, and you figure it out, but they're fired, right? So the CFPB is shut down. The USAID is shut down, despite an order saying you can't do that. It won't matter that whether or not that's at the Supreme Court. As soon as that happens, that is the paradigmatic constitutional crisis, and we're in the middle of it.
We also don't know which cases are going to make it up to the Supreme Court. There's consensus that the Supreme Court's going to resolve the question of birthright citizenship. That's a pure matter of constitutional interpretation. Right. And it will be squarely presented in that case. Now, when it comes to the firings cases, there are a number of cases pending, and the firings affect people at various levels of government. And depending on where somebody is within the executive branch, the issue can be really different. The Supreme Court doesn't have to hear any of these cases if it chooses not to. And it's going to select the case that it wants to hear. Right. And that's also going to determine what's the issue that's being decided and how thoroughly does it resolve it for other cases. It's going to have the ability to exercise control even in determining what case it's going to hear. And there's especially in the firings category of cases, the Supreme Court's going to hear one, probably more of those firing cases, but we don't know if it's going to be sort of rank and file employees. Maybe. Is it going to be people who are at higher levels of government? Almost definitely we'll see some of those. And the president's authority to fire people based on where they are in the chain of command is a really complicated constitutional issue as well.
And will those suits be brought by individual employees, and they're responsible for funding their own legal apparatus, or are these potential for class action, or has that even been thought about?
I don't think you're going to get a class action, but so far you have seen cases brought by unions who represent the workers in these various agencies. You have also seen suits by people who rely on these agencies, both states and individuals. The NAACP joined the suit to stop the shutting down of the CFPB, for example. The thing about anyone who's an individual is they've clearly got standing when they're being fired, right? They have been injured directly by the government's action, and so they have a right to bring a suit. Not everyone does, and we've seen that in one of the cases. The court did say that the parties that happened to file that suit didn't have standing. So that is a technical win, but that's not a win on the merits. Not saying what the government was doing was okay or not okay, neither way. It's just saying the wrong people brought this suit. But I will say also, I can't remember exactly how many, but one group of people who were fired were one of the early moves was to fire 18 inspector generals. Inspector generals in the federal government are sort of like internal affairs. They watch the federal government to make sure the federal government is complying with the law. So they monitor employees and bring cases. And there's been just a swath of firings of those. And several of them have filed suit as individuals. And yeah, you have to pay your own freight. If you're going to bring that kind of suit, maybe somebody will fund that suit for you or help you out, or on pro bono basis will take it, or maybe on a minimum. But the other thing too is that if you're just an individual person as opposed to an institutional plaintiff, say a union or a high-powered official that has a certain amount of wealth, you maybe have kids, you maybe have a mortgage, you've got bills to pay. Yeah. You're not getting paid. Pursuing litigation is costly and time intensive, and you just need a job. Yeah. So, that's why some of these stays are so important, is those people, when you've got a stay, those people are at least still getting paid.
We'll be back to my conversation with Craig Cowie and Constance Vankley after this short break. A New Angle is proudly presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. This show does not happen without these pillars of our community, and I'm so grateful for their support and encouragement. And speaking of support, have you checked out our new website yet? anewanglepodcast.com. There you can support our show directly with a variety of subscription options. Subscribers get access to bonus episodes, additional segments, writings, and other benefits. So check it out at anewanglepodcast.com.
This is Jeff Meese, media technician at the College of Business, and you're listening to A New Angle.
Welcome back to New Angle. I'm speaking with the University of Montana law professors Craig Cowie and Constance about the early days of the second Trump administration. So we've talked a lot in this conversation about these firings. Those are different than this sort of offer to resign, the sort of infamous fork in the road email from Doge. What's that about? And is that legal?
So famously, the fork in the road subject line is the same subject line that Elon Musk used when he made this offer at Twitter. And I think the result was fairly widely regarded as a disaster in the sense that essential employees left and then all of a sudden they had to hire them back. But that really is not applicable in the federal employment context for a few reasons. First of all, I think it's unclear exactly what the offer is because there were a variety of different offers that were coming very fast. There were at least 4 or 5 different versions of the offer at one point, and people may have accepted it at different times, so it's not clear exactly what applied. But the general offer was if you send email with the subject, I resign,
Sure.
then you will be put on administrative leave, so you won't have to work until September 30th when your resignation becomes effective. Now, there are several problems with that. One, there is a statute that says you cannot put someone on administrative leave for more than 2 weeks in a given year. There's obviously more than 2 weeks between now and the end of September. That was done precisely because Congress did not like the fact that the executive, in Congress's view, was overusing administrative leave and that was actually sort of a form of waste. And so they didn't want them to do that. The other problem, which is a much more complicated problem, is that there's a thing called the Anti-Deficiency Act, which is a prohibition on the executive spending money or obligating money, really, that has not been given to it by Congress. And what that means is, as we discussed earlier, right, funding currently is only through March 14th. If Congress were to elect not to fully fund this fork in the road program, then the federal government couldn't pay those people.
Right. So they offer these buyouts and there might not be money for those buyouts.
Exactly. And then the reduction in force rules would kick in. So some of those people could just lose their jobs
be a total mess.
Immediately. Generally, when people have challenged, so if when people have said, hey, the government agreed with me and I didn't get my money because of Congress, the court has rejected those because it would be seen as totally destroying the power of the purse, which is Congress's power, because if the executive could just make an agreement to pay someone when Congress had not appropriated the money, then the executive basically would have the power of the purse if that was enforced. So the courts have not enforced those. So if that were to happen and you agreed, it's not clear that you would have any recourse. You wouldn't be able to enforce the agreement. So that whether that makes it illegal, I don't know. It does mean that if you take it, that is a risk. The other thing is that as the offers were rolling out, the last offer, the contract that I saw, had 2 clauses in it. One clause said that you waive all rights to sue the government for anything related to this agreement. So then that would just take that off. And the other one said we may call you back
Sure.
and then you have to come. So it's not clear to me what you get by accepting the offer. That being said, as of this morning, the reporting is from the government that about 75,000 people have accepted it. Of course, there's also been reporting that some of the people who accepted it were then told that they couldn't take it because they were exempted employees who wouldn't be allowed to resign. So that was sort of interesting. The other thing is that in the average year, the federal government loses about 150,000 employees. So this is about half that. So it's not clear that this is anything other than people who were planning on leaving the government anyways this year. So whether or not it's cost savings in any sense, I have no idea, but it is not of a level yet. And I do think that if people accept it, if it comes through, that's great for them. But there are these legal hurdles to it, and I don't think they're going to have much recourse.
Yeah, it's interesting because those legal hurdles here, if the executive branch, if the president has exceeded executive authority, in fact, they inure to the detriment of the employee and not to the executive necessarily, right? So that's a really interesting way in which action which may be determined to be illegal can blow up on people who are not responsible for it at all.
So we've talked broadly about the separation of powers. Constance, you laid it out there with the purse, the sword, and the pen. It seems like if I were in a street fight, I'd rather have a sword than a pen. If the court has to fight a sword with a pen, I mean, what happens if the president defies a court order and the court wants to flex its power back? What does that look like?
I think that's really why this is the easy case of why that would be a constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
Because the court has some power to enforce its orders. It can use its power of civil and criminal contempt to force a party before the court in that particular proceeding to pay up or to go to jail until they're ready to come into compliance. However, to send somebody to jail, these defendants would not enjoy immunity, but they would be subject to pardon by the president if there were criminal contempt proceedings brought against them. And it would also require, in order to jail somebody, the court can say, you have to go to jail until you come into compliance with this court order, until the people under you within this agency come into compliance with this court order. But the judge isn't going to physically handcuff and shackle and put the person in jail. That's the U.S. Marshals Service. And that's the executive branch too, right? So the court really does have, at bottom, the power of persuasion. It has maybe a bullhorn. It has the ability to interpret the Constitution, to explain itself. But how, if there were that willful noncompliance, I mean, it does not have the tools to force compliance with the executive branch.
I'll push back slightly,
please,
on that. One part of that power is that the courts have power over the lawyers that practice in front of them. And one thing that's true is that no major change in government structure has ever happened without people implementing it. And the people can just refuse to implement it. In fact, we require our soldiers not to commit war crimes, and they're not to undertake unlawful orders. And we require that of our civil servants too. So one thing is that the people being asked to, if they think they're violating the law, they can just say, no, I'm not going to do it, and resign. So we just saw that when the assistant U.S. attorney, or I think she was the acting U.S. attorney at the time, who was in charge of the Eric Adams prosecution, the mayor of New York, she said that she felt like she was being forced to dismiss his case as part of an illegal quid pro quo. In other words, an agreement where he agreed to help President Trump enforce his immigration, and in response, President Trump would drop the case against him. That, she said, in her opinion, that was illegal and violated the law. And she just said she wasn't going to do it. So she resigned. The government then took that case away from her office and gave it to the Public Integrity Unit, where their lawyers resigned and said, we're not going to do it. The other thing is that while the president can pardon people, so the one person from January 6, who the president has not been able to help, is Rudy Giuliani, right? So he's been disbarred. The president can't do anything about that. He's been sued civilly. The president can't do anything about that.
So, and I agree with that. I think that those are good reasons why we may not see that constitutional crisis that everybody's afraid of.
Yeah.
And I will say that there's another reason why I think that that's true, and that's that the executive branch is a lot more powerful when it has the weight of the pen behind it, when they're acting in concert. And there are cases that we will see where the executive branch really legitimately wants the court to agree with it. And if it's an all-out war with the judiciary, it's much less likely to get that. And so I think that there are institutional safeguards. There also is the reality that you need the soldiers. You need people who are willing to do what you are asking them to do. And particularly for lawyers who have ethical obligations, they may not be willing to do that.
Yeah, lawyers, just for the listeners, have ethical obligations to their clients. In this case, if you represent the U.S. government, your client is the U.S. government. But they also owe separate ethical obligations to the courts, and that they, for example, can't lie to the courts, can't help other people lie to the courts, and so forth. So that's why the lawyers involved could be at personal risk if they are doing something that they understand to be illegal. And I think lots of them are really hardworking public servants who just want to follow the law. I think that's what we saw. And in these recent set of resignations, I don't think that necessarily is going to stop. The same thing happened with Nixon in the Saturday Night Massacre, right? And eventually a bunch of people resigned, and then somebody stepped up and fired the person Nixon wanted fired. But at the same time, I don't want to minimize how important it is that people do take those actions. These lawsuits are important, even if you think you're going to lose. It's important to lay it out because we live in a country that is, at its heart, based on the rule of law. It's why we have such a successful economy. It's why we have all the freedoms we do. And so if you object to something, it is really important that you take action. So I think that's why we're seeing this flurry of lawsuits. And whether or not it turns out to ultimately be constitutional in the end, like Constance was talking about, I think is as much about whether or not the people agree that it's constitutional.
Well, and that is a big question. President Trump's approval ratings have never been higher than they are now. They're higher than they were at any point during his first presidency. Craig, Constance, thank you for trying to help us make sense of this. So many things to keep our eye on.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. If you like what we do and want to support us directly, please consider a subscription at anewanglepodcast.com. A New Angle is recorded at Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. Our presenting sponsors are First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Keely Larson is our producer. Maddie Jordan is our production assistant. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music, and Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.